There is something no one tells you about losing your freedom, not the moment it happens, not even the years after. What no one tells you is how ordinary the day looks when it all begins. The sun was out. I remember that clearly. A pale October sun, the kind that gives light without warmth. And I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the elm tree in the yard drop its last leaves onto the mud below. I was 31 years old. I had a house, a husband, a garden I tended with my own hands. I had, as far as I understood it, a life. I'm telling you this now because I want you to understand something before I go any further. What happened to me was not madness. It was something far more deliberate than that, and far colder. I've had many years to turn it over in my mind, more years than I care to count, and I have come to know the shape of it the way you come to know a scar you carry on your body. You stop looking at it eventually, but you never forget it is there. My name was Eleanor Marsh before I married, and I became Eleanor Voss in the spring of 1864, when I was 21 years of age. My husband, Gerald Voss, was a man of modest prosperity. He owned a dry goods store on the main street of our town in western Pennsylvania, a town called Harwick, which I doubt you would find on any map today. He was 10 years older than me, serious in his manner, careful with his money, and not unkind in the early years. I want to be fair about that. In the early years, he was not unkind. We had no children. That was the first wound between us, though neither of us spoke of it in those terms for a long time. 3 years passed, then 4, then 5, and the rooms of the house stayed quiet in the way that tells you something is missing even before you have named what it is. Gerald began to change. Slowly at first, a tightness around his eyes when neighbors spoke of their sons and daughters, a silence at supper that had a different quality than the silence before. I noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not in a single moment, but in a gradual dimming of the air. By the time we had been married 7 years, something else had entered our house. His brother, a man named Thomas Voss, had returned from Ohio after a failed business venture and taken a room above the hardware store 2 streets away. Thomas was a charming man. That is the word people use, charming, with an easy laugh and a habit of appearing exactly when he was least expected. He began to visit often. Too often, I thought. But I said nothing because Gerald seemed lightened by his company, and I was not in the habit of refusing Gerald's small comforts. What I did not see, what I could not see because I was not looking for it, was the conversation that was already happening without me. The 2 of them, Gerald and Thomas, talking in the back room of the store, or at the tavern on Fridays, or in low voices after supper when they thought I had gone upstairs. I did not know what they were planning. I did not know there was anything to plan. The first sign came in the form of a doctor. Gerald announced one evening in September of 1874 that he had arranged for a physician to call on me. Dr. Harlan Pruitt, a man I had seen once at a church social, a quiet man with small hands and a manner that suggested he found most people faintly disappointing. Gerald said it was for my nerves. I told him my nerves were perfectly sound. He looked at me in a way I had not seen before, patient, almost sympathetic, as though I had said something that confirmed a worry he had been carrying quietly for some time. I should have understood then. I should have recognized that look for what it was. But the mind resists certain conclusions the way the body resists cold water. You feel the temperature, but you cannot quite believe the depth until you're already in it. Dr. Pruitt came on a Tuesday. He sat across from me in the front parlor and asked me a series of questions that seemed, individually, entirely reasonable. Did I sleep well? Did I find myself weeping without cause? Had I experienced moments of confusion or unusual emotion? I answered honestly, as I had always been taught to do. I told him that I slept adequately, that I occasionally wept when I felt the loneliness of the house acutely, and that I was sometimes confused by Gerald's moods, which had grown more distant over the years. I told him these things in a calm, measured voice, sitting straight in my chair, my hands folded in my lap. He wrote in his notebook the entire time I spoke. He did not look up often. When he was finished, he thanked me, shook Gerald's hand in the hallway. I heard it, the firm, brief clasp of it, and left. Gerald came back into the parlor and told me that the doctor had confirmed what he feared, that I was suffering from a condition of the nerves that required careful attention. I asked him what condition. He said Dr. Pruitt would explain in time. That was the last week I spent in my own home. I did not know it then. I went to sleep that Tuesday night in my own bed, in my own house, under a quilt I had sewn myself from cloth I had chosen myself, and I thought that whatever was happening, it was something that could be addressed, explained, resolved. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that would take me years to fully understand. The week that followed Dr. Pruitt's visit had a strange quality to it, like the stillness before a storm that has not yet announced itself by any visible sign, only by a pressure in the air that you feel in your chest before you feel it anywhere else. Gerald was attentive in a way he had not been in years. He brought me tea in the mornings without being asked. He inquired after my comfort at supper. He spoke to me gently with a kind of careful patience that I mistook, God help me, for tenderness returning. I see it clearly now for what it was. He was managing me, keeping me calm and unsuspecting the way you keep a lamp trimmed so it does not flare before you're ready to extinguish it. I was not a wife to him anymore in those days. I was a matter to be handled. Thomas came to dinner on the Thursday of that week. He was warm and jovial as always, full of talk about a land deal he was considering in the western counties, and he complimented my cooking with the practiced ease of a man who has learned that flattery costs nothing and purchases a great deal. I remember watching him across the table that evening and feeling something I could not name, not suspicion exactly, more like the faint unease you feel when a room you know well has been rearranged slightly and you cannot immediately identify what has moved. And on Friday morning, Gerald told me that Dr. Pruitt would be returning and that he would be bringing a colleague, a specialist, Gerald called him, a man with particular experience in conditions of the female nervous temperament. I asked Gerald what this specialist's name was. He said Dr. Emmett Crane from Pittsburgh. I asked why a man had been brought from Pittsburgh for something Gerald had described only days earlier as a matter of careful attention. Gerald said that he wanted to be thorough, that he cared about my well-being and wanted the best counsel available. I asked him directly then. I said, Gerald, what is it you believe is wrong with me? He looked at the floor for a moment, just a moment. And then he looked at me and said that I had been displaying signs of nervous exhaustion and emotional instability for some time, and that he was concerned I might cause harm to myself without proper care and supervision. I told him I had never once in my entire life given any indication of such a thing. He nodded slowly, as though my denial itself were evidence of the condition he was describing. That is when the cold reached me. Not fear yet, something before fear, something more like the recognition of a mechanism, the sense that something had been built around you while you were looking elsewhere. Dr. Crane arrived on Saturday. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a dark beard trimmed close, and eyes that moved across a room with professional efficiency rather than genuine curiosity. He shook Gerald's hand with obvious familiarity. They had met before. I understood at once. This was not an introduction, but a reunion of sorts. He greeted me with formal courtesy and asked if we might speak privately in the parlor. We spoke for perhaps 40 minutes. He asked many of the same questions Dr. Pruitt had asked, but his manner was different. Where Pruitt had seemed indifferent, Crane was alert in a way that made me feel observed rather than examined. He asked about my moods during certain times of the month. He asked whether I had ever thrown objects in anger. He asked whether I had made accusations against my husband that I had later regretted. I answered each question with care, watching his pencil move across the page, understanding with growing dread that my answers, whatever they were being fitted into a shape that had already been decided. When he left the parlor, he spoke with Gerald in the hallway for a long time. I sat in my chair and listened to the low, continuous murmur of their voices, unable to make out words, only tone, the tone of men discussing an arrangement. After some time, Gerald came back in alone. He sat down across from me and told me, in a quiet and almost sorrowful voice, that Dr. Crane had confirmed a diagnosis of acute moral insanity with melancholic features, and that both physicians were in agreement that I required institutional care. Moral insanity. I want you to understand what that phrase meant in those years, because it is not a diagnosis that required evidence in any form you or I would recognize as evidence. It meant, in the language of that time, that a person's character had become disordered, that their judgments, their feelings, their sense of what was right had gone wrong in some essential way. It was a diagnosis that could be applied to almost any woman who did not behave as her husband required. It needed no proof beyond the word of 2 physicians and the signature of a husband. Gerald had all 3. The papers, I later learned, had been signed before Dr. Crane set foot in my parlor. The commitment had been arranged before he ever asked me a single question. The examination was a formality, a performance staged for the sake of appearances, so that what was being done to me would have the shape of medicine rather than the shape of what it actually was. I did not learn this until much later. On that Saturday evening, I still believed, with the stubborn faith of someone who has not yet been fully broken, that there had been a misunderstanding, that if I could speak clearly and calmly to the right person, it would be corrected. Gerald told me to pack a small bag. He said I would be leaving on Monday morning. I packed the bag. I do not know why I packed it so neatly. Habit, perhaps. The habit of order when everything else is disorder. Monday came the way difficult things always come, without ceremony, without any sign from the world that this day was different from the one before it. The elm tree in the yard stood bare now. The mud in the path had hardened overnight with the first serious cold of the season. I carried my bag to the front door myself because Gerald did not offer to carry it, and I remember the weight of it in my hand, so small, that bag, for everything a life is supposed to contain. A carriage came at 8 in the morning. Not Gerald's carriage, a hired one, dark, with a driver I had never seen before, a heavy-set man who looked at me with the practiced blankness of someone paid not to notice things. Gerald stood at the door in his coat and hat. He had told me the night before that he would accompany me to the facility to ensure I arrived safely, he said. Those were the words he chose, to ensure I arrived safely. We rode for nearly 4 hours. The road took us northeast, through country I knew at first and then through country I did not, hills flattening into a wider, grayer landscape, the trees thinning, the sky pressing down lower with each mile as though the world were narrowing. Gerald sat across from me in the carriage and said almost nothing. He looked out the window. Once, I asked him where exactly we were going, and he said the name, Gray Hill State Hospital for the Insane in Westmore County. I had never heard of it. I turned the name over in my mind for the rest of the journey, trying to make it feel real, the way you press a bruise to confirm it is there. We came over a low rise in the road, and I saw it before Gerald said anything. A large stone building set back from a long gravel drive, 3 stories tall, with rows of narrow windows that gave nothing back, no reflection, no light, only an absence that felt deliberate. The grounds around it were well kept in the mechanical way of places that use labor to fill time, rather than to tend something living. There were iron fences along the perimeter, not tall enough to be dramatic, but solid enough to be final. Gerald helped me down from the carriage. He carried my bag the last 50 yards, I noticed, as though that small gesture of courtesy meant something, or was meant to suggest it did. We were met at the entrance by a man who introduced himself as the assistant superintendent, a Mr. Aldous Finch, thin, pale, with the air of someone who had spent so many years indoors that the outside world had become faintly theoretical to him. He shook Gerald's hand and consulted a ledger he was carrying under his arm. He did not shake my hand. He spoke about me to Gerald as though I were not standing between them. He said that the admitting process would take approximately 1 hour, that my personal effects would be cataloged and stored, and that Gerald was welcome to visit on the designated days, which were the first and third Sunday of each month. Gerald nodded at each point. Then he turned to me, and for a moment, just one moment, something moved across his face that I could not entirely read. Not guilt exactly, something more like discomfort, the look of a man setting down a burden he is relieved to be rid of, but does not wish to examine too closely. He said, "I hope you will be well taken care of here, Eleanor." I said nothing. I had nothing to say that would have changed anything, and I had learned, in the 72 hours since the papers were signed, that speaking clearly and calmly to the right person was not going to save me. There was no right person. There was only this gravel drive and this stone building and this ledger with my name already written in it. They took me inside. The admitting room was small and smelled of carbolic soap and something beneath it that the soap was trying to cover, a damp, organic smell that I would come to know very well in the months ahead, the smell of many people living in a closed space. A woman in a gray dress and white apron recorded my name, my age, my husband's name and occupation, the names of the attending physicians, the stated diagnosis. She did it without looking up, in the manner of someone transcribing rather than listening. I was 31 years old of sound mind, and I watched her write the words, acute moral insanity, in a column beside my name with a nib pen in ink that would not wash out. They took my bag. Each item was removed, named aloud, and placed in a labeled box. My spare dress, my hairbrush, the small book of verses I had brought because I thought reading might be permitted, a photograph of my mother, taken in her middle years, the only one I had. The woman in the apron held the photograph briefly, glanced at it with the same expression she gave everything, and placed it in the box. I did not ask if I would see these things again. I understood already that asking questions here would be interpreted as agitation, and agitation would be interpreted as confirmation of the diagnosis. I was given a gray dress like the one the woman was wearing, coarse at the collar, loose through the body, the kind of garment designed to make all women look the same and none look like themselves. I put it on behind a curtain. I folded my own dress and left it on the chair as I had been instructed. Then a different woman, younger with tired eyes, led me down a corridor and through a heavy door that was unlocked with a key from her belt and locked again behind us. And I heard that sound for the first time, the solid, irrevocable turn of a lock in a door between me and everything I had known. That sound, I would hear it every day for the next 3 years. The ward I was placed in held 23 women. I counted them on my first evening, standing at the edge of the long common room, while the light through the narrow windows turned from gray to a darker gray and then to nothing. 23 women in various states of stillness and motion, some seated along the walls on wooden benches, some moving in slow, repeated patterns across the floor, some simply standing and looking at things that were not there. I stood among them and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that I was now indistinguishable from them, at least to any eye that passed through that door with a key. The daily structure of Gray Hill was rigid in the way that institutions are rigid, not because rigidity serves the people inside, but because it serves the people running them. We rose at 5:30 to the sound of a bell. We washed at a long tin basin in cold water, regardless of the season. We ate in a dining room at 6, at noon, and at 5. The food was adequate in the way that answers a biological need, without acknowledging that the person eating it is anything more than a body requiring maintenance. Porridge in the mornings, a thin soup at midday, bread and boiled vegetables in the evenings. On Sundays, there was sometimes a piece of salt pork, which the women around me treated with a reverence that told me how little else they had to look forward to. After breakfast, we returned to the common room. There was no organized activity in those first months. That would come later, under a different attendant, and even then it was modest. Mostly, we sat. Women who had been there for years had developed their own private economies of time. One woman near the window spent her mornings braiding and unbraiding a length of yarn she kept in her apron pocket. Another, arranged and rearranged small stones she had collected from the exercise yard into patterns on the floor beside her bench. I watched these rituals with a mixture of sorrow and respect. They were not signs of madness. They were signs of minds trying to stay alive inside a space that offered them almost nothing to hold on to. The attendants were not uniformly cruel. I want to be accurate about this because it would be easy and perhaps satisfying to describe them all as monsters, and that would not be true. Some were indifferent, which in its own way was its own kind of cruelty. The cruelty of people who have stopped seeing the individuals in their charge as fully real. A few were genuinely harsh, quick with a sharp word or a rough hand when a woman became difficult, which is to say when a woman became distressed in a way that was inconvenient, and one or two showed occasional, quiet decency, an extra moment of patience, a softened tone, which stood out precisely because it was so rare and so clearly contrary to what the place expected of them. The head attendant on our ward was a woman named Mrs. Breckett. She was perhaps 50 years of age, with a broad, weathered face and hands that looked like they had spent decades managing difficult things. She was not cruel in any dramatic sense. She was something more mundane and more damaging. She was absolutely certain of the order of things. The physicians knew. The institution decided. The women inside were there because they needed to be there. This belief was so settled in her that it was no longer something she thought. It was simply the ground she stood on. To her, a woman who protested her confinement was demonstrating the very condition that warranted confinement. There was no argument available to us that she would not interpret as further evidence against us. I learned this within my first 2 weeks. I had requested, through the proper channel, which meant asking Mrs. Breckett directly in a calm voice at the appropriate time of day, whether I might write a letter to my sister in Philadelphia. My sister's name was Catherine, and she was, as far as I knew, unaware of what had happened to me. Gerald had told me, on the carriage ride, that he had informed my family that I had been taken ill and was receiving rest and care. What he had told them specifically, I did not know. I had not been permitted to write to anyone before I left Harwick. Mrs. Breckett listened to my request with the expression of someone hearing a noise rather than a question. She told me that correspondence was a privilege extended to patients who had demonstrated stability, and that I was still in my assessment period and therefore not yet eligible. I asked how long the assessment period lasted. She said it varied by case. I asked who determined when it had ended. She said the attending physician. I asked when I might speak with the attending physician. She said he came to the ward on Wednesdays and saw patients at his discretion. I thanked her and returned to my bench. I sat with that conversation for a long time afterward, turning its logic over and examining it the way you examine a locked box, looking for a seam. There was none. Every door led back to the same room. The physician determined my stability. My stability determined my privileges. My privileges included the ability to contact the outside world. And until the physician decided I was stable, which required his assessment, which required access to him, which required privilege, I was sealed inside a perfect, circular silence. That silence was not accidental. I came to understand this gradually, and the understanding settled in my chest like a stone I would carry for a long time. I had not been sent to Grey Hill to be healed. I'd been sent here to disappear. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. I had been alone before. Long evenings in the Harwick house when Gerald was at the store. Whole Sundays when the silence of the rooms pressed against me with a weight I had learned to manage. But that loneliness had edges. It ended. This was different. This was a loneliness without a visible boundary, a loneliness that had been institutionalized, given a schedule and a gray dress and a bench to sit on. What saved me, and I use that word carefully, because salvation inside Gray Hill was a modest and provisional thing, was the women around me. Not all of them. Some were too far inside themselves to reach, and I respected that distance the way you respect the closed door of someone who is suffering privately. But some of them were as present and as clear-minded as anyone I had ever known on the outside, and it was among them that I found the closest thing to solid ground that the ward offered. The first was a woman named Ruth Hadley. She had been at Gray Hill for 4 years when I arrived, committed at the age of 38 by her father and her eldest son following her husband's death, when she had refused to transfer management of the family farm to the son and had instead attempted to run it herself. That was the sum of her offense. She had wanted to keep what was hers, and the men around her had found a physician willing to describe that desire as an unhealthy fixation, indicating disordered judgment. Ruth was 52 when I met her, lean and quiet, with gray eyes that assessed everything quickly and gave nothing away unnecessarily. She was the one who explained to me, in the measured tones of someone who has had years to organize her understanding, exactly how the machinery of the place worked. She told me which attendants would leave you alone if you gave them no cause to notice you, and which ones watched for reasons of their own that had nothing to do with your welfare. She told me that the Wednesday physician, a Dr. Selden, was not a bad man, but was an overwhelmed one. He saw too many patients in too little time and relied almost entirely on the attendants' written reports when making any decision about a patient's status. This meant that Mrs. Brackett's opinion of you was, in practical terms, the only opinion that mattered. She told me that letters sent through the official channel were read before they were posted, and that anything resembling a complaint or a plea was simply not sent. She told me this without bitterness, in the tone of someone sharing useful information about weather or road conditions. It was, I understood, how she had survived 4 years with her mind intact. The second woman I came to know well was younger, a girl almost named Dora Sims, who was 24 years old and had been brought in 6 months before my arrival. Dora's situation was different from Ruth's and from mine in its particulars, but identical in its essential structure. A man had wanted something. A physician had provided the paperwork, and Dora had been removed from her own life without recourse. In her case, it was a brother-in-law who had coveted a small inheritance left to her by her grandmother. The inheritance was not large, enough to buy a modest house and live quietly for some years, but it was enough for someone to go to the trouble. Dora had a quality that I came to value enormously in that place. She noticed things, small things, the kind that slip past most people. She noticed which attendant lingered an extra moment near the door when the evening bell rang. She noticed that the ward's supply of a particular sedative was inconsistent, heavy on some weeks, lighter on others. and that the patients were measurably quieter or more agitated in rough correspondence with those fluctuations. She noticed that certain women were moved to different wards, not because their condition had changed, but because they had begun talking to each other in ways that seemed, to the staff, to be organizing rather than merely conversing. She told me these things in a low voice during the exercise period when we walked the small yard in pairs and the attendant was far enough away that conversation was possible. I asked her once why she observed all of this so carefully. She said that knowing where you are is the only power you have when you cannot change where you are. It was the wisest thing I heard during my entire time at Gray Hill, and I have thought of it many times since, in entirely different circumstances. There was a third woman whose name I never learned with certainty. She told me once to call her Margaret, and once told me her name was something else entirely, and I decided eventually that both might be true for different reasons. She had been at Gray Hill longer than anyone on our ward could reliably remember. She was old, 70, perhaps more, with white hair and a stillness about her that was not emptiness, but something more like the stillness of a person who has passed through a great storm and come out the other side into a quiet country. She spoke rarely, but when she did, it was always precise. She said to me, perhaps 3 months into my time there, without preamble or explanation, as though she were continuing a conversation we had not yet begun. They put you here to make you doubt yourself. The moment you start doubting yourself, they have won something they cannot win any other way. I did not answer her. I did not need to. I looked at her and she looked at me, and we understood each other completely in the way that people sometimes do when they have both been reduced to the same essential thing and have chosen, each in their own manner, to remain. I held those words for a very long time. I hold them still. By the time my first winter at Gray Hill had passed, and the yard mud had softened again into something resembling spring, I had been at the hospital for 5 months. 5 months during which Gerald had visited exactly once, on a first Sunday in December, 3 weeks after my arrival. He had sat across from me in the visiting room, a narrow space with a table between us and an attendant standing near the door, and he had asked me how I was being treated. I told him I was being treated as someone who had been falsely committed and wished to go home. He looked at the table. He said he hoped I would apply myself to getting well. He did not come again. I had spent those 5 months doing what Ruth had advised, keeping myself unremarkable, speaking when spoken to, eating what was given, moving through the schedule without friction. I had watched Dr. Selden on his Wednesday rounds, studying the rhythm of his visits, how long he spent with each patient, what seemed to catch his attention, what seemed to satisfy him enough to move on. He was, as Ruth had described, a harried man. He arrived with a ledger and left with a ledger, and in between, he moved through the ward with the efficiency of someone completing a task rather than attending to human beings. He had a decent face, I thought. Not a bad man, simply one who had stopped looking closely. I decided to write a letter, not through the official channel. Ruth had already made clear what became of those, but directly to Dr. Selden, handed to him personally during his Wednesday rounds. I spent 2 weeks composing it in my mind before I committed a single word to paper, because I knew I would have one opportunity, and that the manner of the letter was as important as its content, possibly more so. It could not read as distressed. It could not read as accusatory. It had to be precisely calibrated, clear, measured, specific, in a way that would be difficult to dismiss as the agitation of an unstable mind. I wrote it on a Tuesday evening using paper and a pencil stub that Dora had obtained through means she did not fully explain. I wrote that I was requesting a formal review of my commitment on the grounds that the diagnosis had been reached without adequate examination, and that the two physicians involved had a prior relationship with my husband that constituted a conflict of interest. I named Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Crane. I named Gerald. I described the sequence of events from Dr. Pruitt's first visit to the morning of the carriage. I kept my sentences short and my language plain. I signed my full name, Eleanor Voss, formerly Marsh, and the date. Ruth read it when I was finished. She read it twice, slowly, and handed it back without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "It is good. It is very good." And then she said, "Be prepared for what happens after you give it to him." I gave it to Dr. Selden the following Wednesday. He was moving between patients, ledger under his arm, when I stepped toward him and held out the folded paper and asked if he would read it at his convenience. He looked at the paper and then at me with the mild wariness of a man who has learned that unexpected things from patients are usually inconvenient. He took it. He put it in the ledger without reading it. He moved on. For 3 days, nothing happened. I continued through the schedule. I slept. I ate. I walked the yard. I watched Dora watching things and Ruth braiding her yarn and the old woman they called Margaret sitting in her corner with her ancient, patient stillness. On the 4th day, Mrs. Breckett called me to the attendance room off the main corridor and told me, standing very straight, that Dr. Selden had received my correspondence and found it indicative of a persecutory ideation, which she explained was a condition in which a patient constructs elaborate false beliefs about being wrongfully treated. She said this to my face, to the face of a woman who had been committed on the signature of a husband who wanted to be rid of her by 2 physicians who had been arranged in advance on a diagnosis that required no evidence. She said to this woman's face that her belief in her own wrongful treatment was itself a symptom of illness. I held very still. I thought of what Margaret had said. The moment you start doubting yourself, they have won something they cannot win any other way. I did not doubt myself. I looked at Mrs. Breckett and I said, in the calmest voice I have ever produced in my life, "I understand. Thank you for telling me." She watched me for a moment, as though waiting for something to crack. Nothing cracked. I returned to the common room and sat on my bench and looked at the wall and breathed slowly for a very long time. The consequence came 2 days later. I was moved to a different room, not a different ward, but a smaller room off the main sleeping hall, with a single cot and a window too high to see out of properly. The official reason, as Mrs. Breckett explained it, was that I needed additional rest in a quieter environment. Ruth and Dora and I all understood what it actually was, isolation, as a reminder of what further protest would cost. A demonstration, delivered through architecture, of the institution's patience and its reach. I lay on that cot the first night in the small room, and I stared at the ceiling, And I thought about Catherine, my sister in Philadelphia, who did not know where I truly was. I thought about what it would take to get a letter to her through a channel that did not pass through Mrs. Brackett's hands. I thought for a long time. Then I stopped thinking and simply lay there in the dark, keeping myself company, which was the only company available. The small room lasted 6 weeks before they moved me back to the common ward, and in those 6 weeks I learned something about silence that I had not known before, that it's not a single thing, not merely the absence of sound, but a substance with its own texture and weight. Some silences rest. This one pressed. It pressed in the hours before the morning bell, when the darkness in the room was complete, and the stone walls held the cold in a way that no amount of blankets fully answered. It pressed in the afternoons when the light through the high window moved in its slow arc across the ceiling, and I counted the minutes between one position and the next. But it also gave me something. And I say this not to make something noble out of what was simply punishment, but because it is true. The enforced quiet of those 6 weeks allowed me to think in a way that the common room, with its noise and motion and need, had not permitted. I thought about Catherine with a new precision. I thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and what she would need to be told, and in what form, to be moved to act rather than simply to grieve. Catherine was 4 years younger than me and had lived in Philadelphia since her marriage to a man named William Hartwell, a printer with a small but reputable shop near the waterfront. William was a careful, principled man. I'd always thought so. And more importantly, he was a man with connections to other men who dealt in paper and law and the movement of information. I did not need Catherine to be my advocate. I needed her to find someone who could be. The question was getting a letter to her that would arrive unread. The official channel was closed, as I knew. The visiting room was supervised. What I needed was a hand willing to carry something out of the building without it passing through the ledger. The answer came not through planning, but through observation, which is to say, through Dora. When I returned to the common ward after my 6 weeks of isolation, thinner and quieter but fundamentally unaltered, Dora fell into step beside me during the morning exercise period and told me in her low, unhurried voice that she had noticed something during my absence. There was a young man, a laborer who came twice a week to assist with deliveries to the hospital kitchen, coal largely, and sometimes dry goods from a supplier in the nearest town. He came on Tuesdays and Fridays, entered through the service gate at the rear of the building, and on his way out, passed within 30 feet of the exercise yard fence. Dora had watched him for several weeks. He was young, perhaps 19 or 20, and he had a quality she described simply as not yet hardened by this place, by which she meant he still saw the women in the yard as people rather than as fixtures of the institution. She had already spoken to him through the fence during the exercise period on a Friday 2 weeks before my return. She had asked him whether he would carry a letter to the post office in town and send it on behalf of a woman who had no other means of correspondence. He had looked at her for a long time. She described the look as a boy trying to determine the weight of a thing before picking it up. And then he had said he would think about it. On the following Tuesday, he had said yes. His name was James Carey, and I never met him face to face. The letters passed through Dora, folded small, exchanged at the fence during the brief window when the attending attendant was at the far end of the yard. He asked for nothing in return, which is the thing about him that I have returned to most often in the years since. A young man with no stake in any of it, no obligation, no obvious reason. And he said yes, and he carried the letters, and he never spoke of it to anyone inside those walls. I wrote to Catherine in October of 1875, nearly a year after my arrival at Grayhill. I told her everything, not in the tone of anguish. I had been in that room with the high window long enough to understand that anguish on paper would be read as instability, even by someone who loved me. I wrote factually. I named Gerald. I named the physicians. I named the dates and the sequence of events. I told her I was of sound mind and that I could demonstrate this to any impartial person willing to examine me. I asked her to consult William, and through William, a lawyer, and through a lawyer, whatever legal mechanism existed for the review of a commitment obtained through false testimony. I gave the letter to Dora on a Thursday evening. On Friday, she passed it to James Carey at the fence, and then I waited. Waiting inside Grayhill was its own discipline. The days did not accelerate because you needed them to. The schedule continued. The bell, the basin, the porridge, the common room, the yard, the soup, the bench, the bread, the bell again. Ruth watched me during that period with a steadiness that I found more comforting than any word she could have offered. She did not ask often how I was managing. She simply remained, present, consistent, real, which was the thing I most needed from another human being. 3 weeks after the letter went out, I received a reply. It arrived not through any official channel, but folded inside a paper sack of dried beans that James Carey delivered to the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and left by some private arrangement with Dora, where she could collect it. Catherine's handwriting, 4 pages. I sat in the corner of the common room and read it twice and then a third time, and the feeling that moved through me was not joy exactly. Joy seemed too clean a word for something that still had so far to travel. It was more like the moment when you have been holding your breath so long you have forgotten you were holding it, and then you breathe, and the air enters you all at once. She knew she was moving. William had already spoken to a man. The man William had spoken to was a lawyer named Edward Forsyth, and he was not young, and he was not dramatic, and he did not arrive at Grayhill on a white horse with justice burning in his eyes. He was a compact, methodical man in his mid-50s with a worn leather satchel and the manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the truth was being argued over and had learned that patience outlasts almost everything else. Catherine wrote that he had reviewed the commitment papers Gerald had filed and had identified what he called procedural irregularities, a phrase so restrained for what had been done to me that I almost laughed when I read it, alone in my corner of the common room, the letter pressed flat against my knee. What Forsyth had found was this. The 2 physicians who had signed my commitment papers, Dr. Pruitt and Dr. Crane, were required under Pennsylvania statute to conduct their examinations independently without prior consultation. The paperwork indicated they had submitted a joint assessment drafted in language so nearly identical between their 2 documents that it could only have been composed together or by one man and signed by both. Additionally, the commitment had been filed in a county courthouse 2 days before Dr. Crane's examination had taken place, meaning the date on the legal document predated the examination it was supposed to be based on. Gerald, or someone advising Gerald, had made an error in their confidence. They had moved too quickly and had not bothered to align the dates. It took 4 more months. I want to be honest about that because there is a temptation, when telling a story that ends in release, to compress the waiting into something brief and bearable, to move quickly from hope to resolution as though the distance between them were small. It was not small. It was 4 months of continuing to rise at 5:30, of continuing to wash in cold water, of continuing to eat the porridge and the soup and the bread, of continuing to walk the yard in pairs with Dora while the sky above the fence moved through winter into something tentative and gray-green that might eventually become spring. Forsyth worked through the courts rather than through the hospital administration, which was the correct instinct. Going through the hospital would have meant going through Dr. Selden, and Dr. Selden would have gone to Mrs. Breckett, and Mrs. Breckett would have found a way to make my behavior in the preceding months evidence of ongoing instability. Instead, a writ was filed in the county court in February of 1876, requesting a habeas corpus hearing on the grounds that my confinement had been obtained through fraudulent documentation. I was not told any of this directly. I knew it through Catherine's letters, which continued to arrive through the same narrow channel, folded small, carried by James Carey, collected by Dora, delivered to me in the exercise yard with the quiet efficiency of something that had become routine. I kept each letter in the seam of my mattress and read them until the folds were soft as cloth. The hearing was held in March. I was not transported to the courthouse. That was not how it worked. Forsyth appeared on my behalf, presenting the documentation, the date discrepancies, and an affidavit from a physician in Philadelphia whom Catherine had engaged to review the original diagnosis. This physician, who had never met me and had assessed my case only through written record, stated that the diagnosis of acute moral insanity had been applied without clinical basis, and that the documentation suggested the examination had been conducted to confirm a conclusion, reached in advance rather than to arrive at one through evidence. I was told the outcome on a Wednesday morning in late March, not by Mrs. Breckett and not by Dr. Selden, but by a man I had never seen before, a court officer who arrived at the ward with paperwork and spoke to the assistant superintendent in the entrance hall, while I stood a short distance away and understood from the quality of the silence around me that something had shifted in the building's relationship to me. They gave me back my box. The gray dress went into a pile near the door. My own dress, folded since October of 1874, went back onto my body. The hairbrush, the book of verses, the photograph of my mother. I held that photograph for a long moment before I put it in my bag. My mother's face, middle-aged and patient, looking slightly past the camera at something the photographer had not captured. Ruth was in the common room when I came to say goodbye. She stood and took both my hands and held them and said nothing for a moment. And then she said, "Remember this place, not to suffer it again, but so it cannot be made invisible." I told her I would. I meant it in the way you mean things when they have been paid for with a great deal. Dora embraced me quickly, fiercely, and let go. The old woman called Margaret watched from her corner with her ancient, still eyes and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that passes between people who have understood the same thing through different suffering. I walked out through the entrance hall and down the gravel drive. Catherine was waiting at the gate with a hired carriage and her face undone with relief. I got in and we drove away, and I did not look back, not out of bitterness, but because everything I needed to carry from that place I was already carrying inside me. Gerald and I were legally separated within the year. Thomas Voss left Pennsylvania not long after the hearing. Dr. Crane faced a formal inquiry that resulted in no punishment of any consequence, which I will not pretend did not wound me, because it did. But here's what I know now, at this great distance, looking back across everything. They put me in that place to make me disappear, and I did not disappear. Not because I was exceptional, but because Ruth held steady, and Dora watched carefully, and a young man named James Carey said yes when he could easily have said nothing. We kept each other real. That is the whole of the lesson, and it is enough. If you're listening to this, and I believe someone is, otherwise why speak at all? Remember that injustice depends on silence the way fire depends on air. Withdraw the silence. Bear witness. Pass it forward. That is all any of us can do. That is everything.